Spokane First family, if you have your Bibles, turn to the book of John, chapter 16. That is where we're going to be today. John chapter 16, and we're going to start in verse 16. John chapter 16, starting right in verse 16. We're in the third week of our series, The Ascension, where we have been chronicling the events of Jesus from Jesus being anointed at Bethany by Mary. And then last week on Palm Sunday, we took a look at the triumphal entry. And obviously this week, we're going to take some time looking at the resurrection of Jesus. But really, this series is going to take us through the events that ultimately lead to the ascension of Jesus, where he ascends into heaven to sit at the right hand of the Father. And every single one of these steps that Jesus takes along the way to his ascension, man, is just packed full of life and freedom and hope, and just if we were to put these things into practice, would really bring about so much in our lives. The dictionary defines sorrow as this: a feeling of deep distress caused by loss, disappointment, or other misfortune suffered by oneself or others. I think a lot of you would echo my personal feeling that this season that we are all experiencing together has brought with it much sorrow. That there's a lot of us that consistently feel deep distress that's either caused by loss or disappointment. And I think for some of you, or for some of us, this sorrow is the result of loss. You know, I think about just thinking about my kids and them not being able to go to school. And I know for some that was like, yes, no more school. I think if I was in middle school or high school right now at this time, I think that would be my reaction. But, you know, my girls were actually really sad. They were like, no. My daughter Audrey actually said, no, I was just becoming popular. So she was really, really sad about school being shut down. But I think of like seniors. And Amber and I were just talking about that this last week, that there's all these milestones and graduations and proms and things that they're not going to be able to experience, like baccalaureates and, I don't know, senior skip days, if that's a thing anymore. It was when I was in high school. Maybe it was just for the bad kids. I don't know. But there's things that we're losing. Maybe for others of us, it's jobs. We've lost our jobs, and now we find ourselves without any source of provision. There's no income that's coming in. I think of like athletes and people who are involved in extracurricular things. They've lost, some of them, their final chance to actually engage and participate in the things that they love, and maybe they weren't able to continue that in college, and now they've missed out on their final chance, and families not being able to go on vacations, and even today, there's so many traditions that are just gone, that we've lost today. We don't get to have our normal Easter celebration or family over, or buy our new clothes, or all of the things that normally come with Easter. This season has taken those things from us, and we've lost them. For some of us, this sorrow is a result of things that are being threatened. I think this is creating a lot of what ifs. Right? Some of us feel like our jobs are potentially threatened. Some of us feel like our health is going to be threatened. I think there's a lot of things that this season is threatening, that we hold very tightly to. Some of us, this sorrow is a result of just our present circumstances. Maybe we're isolated, we're alone, we have family that's far away, and we don't have a lot of connections. Some of us, we're just distanced from other people, and just the present circumstances, we're away from others, are just leading to a deep sense of sorrow. This season, okay, the realities of this season seemingly fan the flames of sorrow. But here's the good news. On Easter Sunday, here is the good news for you, that as followers of Jesus, we get to see sorrow differently. that because of the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, and when we put our faith and hope in him, we get to see sorrow differently. And it changes the way we allow sorrow to impact us every single day. And today, in the book of John chapter 16, Jesus shows us that sorrow is something that we need to see differently. Jesus teaches us that in light of the cross, here's how we should see sorrow. So that's what we're going to spend all of our time talking about. That's the question that we're going to be answering today. How should we see sorrow? Let's pray. Jesus, we love you so much. And God, today as we go to your word, Father, I pray that it comes alive to us. Lord, that it meets us right where we're at. Lord, for some of us, this feeling of sorrow, of sadness, of suffering, loss, grief. Lord, some of us, it's absolutely overwhelming. It's crippling. It's paralyzing us today. Father, allow the good news of Easter to penetrate all of that and change the way that we see sorrow. We love you, Jesus, that you meet us everywhere that we could possibly find ourselves. Lord, in your precious name. Amen. Okay, John chapter 16. We're going to get started in verse 16. A little while, and you will see me no longer. And again, a little while, you will see me. So some of his disciples said to one another, what is this that he says to us? A little while, and you will not see me. And again, a little while, and you will see me. So, and because I am going to the Father. So they were saying, what does he mean by a little while? We do not know what he's talking about. So verse 19, Jesus knew that they wanted to ask him. So he said to them, is this what you were asking yourselves? What I meant by saying a little while and you will not see me, and again a little while and you will see me? Truly, truly, I say to you, you will weep and lament, but the world will rejoice. You will be sorrowful, but your sorrow will turn into joy. When a woman is giving birth, she has sorrow because her hour is come. But when she has delivered the baby, she no longer remembers the anguish for joy that a human being has been born into the world. So also you have sorrow now, but I will see you again, and your hearts will rejoice, and no one will take your joy from you. In that day you will ask nothing of me. Truly, truly, I say to you, whatever you ask of the Father in my name, he will give it to you. Until now, you have asked nothing in my name. Ask, and you will receive, that your joy may be full. I love this exchange between Jesus and his disciples. And obviously, if you've read any amount of the Gospels, you know it's not an uncommon exchange where Jesus is dropping profound knowledge on his guys, and they are blank. They got blank stares. They're like, what? And this is just another example of that. So here's Jesus saying, right now you see me, but soon you won't see me, and I have to leave, but then I'll be back, and I'm going to go to the Father and all this stuff. And it is confusing. And he knows that they're challenged by it, right? Because they're probably asking themselves, what is he talking about? What does he mean by a little while? What does he mean he's going to be gone and we can't see him? We're going to play hide and seek or something like that. What is happening in this moment? And Jesus lovingly, gently, graciously addresses their confusion. He's like, hey guys, were you confused about what I had said earlier about leaving and you not being able to go with me, and then I'll be back and going to the Father and all that stuff? And then in verse 20, he begins to explain what he's talking about. Now, we know exactly what he's talking about. We know he's talking about his death, burial, and resurrection. He's prophesying, he's forecasting, he's foretelling. He's like, this is what is about to happen. He's in Jerusalem. This is a portion of text called the Final Discourse. He's heading towards the garden during this conversation. So he knows exactly what is about to happen. And so do we, because we've read to the end, but his disciples are totally confused. And so here is Jesus addressing the sorrow that his disciples will experience when he is dead, when he is buried, but then what will happen to their sorrow when he comes back, when he resurrects. And he begins the explanation in verse 20. Take a look at what Jesus says to us in verse 20. Truly, truly, I say to you, you will weep and lament, but the world will rejoice. You will be sorrowful, but your sorrow will turn into joy. Your sorrow will turn into joy. Now, Jesus isn't pulling any punches here when it comes to sorrow, okay? He's not trying to sugarcoat this. He's like, guys, there's no way around it. You will be sad. You will lament. You will weep. You will have sorrow. It's almost like he's telling us, he's like, man, in this life, there is going to be sadness. It is an inevitability. It is an eventuality. You cannot stop yourself. You cannot create a life in which you don't encounter and experience sorrow to some degree. And here's this is what Jesus is saying. He's like, guys, you're going to be sad, but your sorrow will turn into joy. What is Jesus saying here? He's like, hey, listen, you are going to be sad, but because of what he's going to do through his death, burial, and resurrection, as followers of Jesus, we don't have to stay there. Sorrow is not something we have to settle for. Sorrow is not somewhere that we have to stay. We have been saved from sorrow. And I think it's important that we see this and hear this and understand this, because the emotions that we feel in the midst of sorrow are so big that it's almost as if we feel like this is what we have to settle for. This is where we have to stay. That was me at some point. When all of this news broke, I'm going to be honest with you, okay? When all of this news broke and everyone's saying all these people are getting infected and the COVID-19 thing is getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and there's this, we got to flatten the curve and all this stuff. When they shut down schools, okay, there was a small part of me that was like, ooh, this could be fun. My kids are going to be home. Maybe it'll be like an early summer vacation. Maybe that'll be kind of something like that. But then, as the restrictions got more and more and more intense, and more and more and more narrow and more refined, I found myself just like falling into myself. And I was like this like rebelliousness in me that was like, ah. And then this is probably a few weeks ago. It was after church on a Sunday. Obviously I showed up and we were here and it was an empty room and no one was laughing at my jokes and nobody was engaged in my stories and I wasn't getting any like amens, that's good, way to go during my message. And I walked off the stage, I walked into my office, and man, I was so sad. I was so sad. I completely tanked. I was like, man, there was so much that had been turned upside down. There was so much that was new, that was outside of my normal rhythm. There was so much future hopes and dreams and anticipations that were robbed from me that it just became too much. And I literally just got in my car and I drove around Spokane for like an hour, just all by myself in my car. And I just wanted to stay that way. I didn't want to like feel better. And I think that happens to all of us. We all get to a place where sorrow just feels comfortable, where it's just like, this is where I want to stay. This is what feels good right now. And we just kind of want to indulge that sorrow. And at some point in that drive, I had to say to myself, you know what? No more. I don't have to stay here. I don't have to settle for this. Jesus did not die on a cross for me to drive around moping, sorrowful all day. Jesus made a way to joy. Jesus made a way to hope. And so I can cling to this promise no matter how dark things get, no matter how uncertain things become. I can cling to this promise that sorrow, even though it shows up, I don't have to settle for it. I don't have to stay in a posture of sorrow. I can begin to make my way to joy. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He doesn't just stop by showing us that sorrow is not somewhere that we have to stay. He also shows us something else in verse 21. Take a look at what Jesus says to us. When a woman is giving birth, she has sorrow because her hour has come. But when she has delivered the baby, she no longer remembers the anguish for joy that a human being has been born into the world. I don't know if any of you have experienced childbirth from beginning to end, but anguish probably does not do it justice, okay? My wife has given birth to 4 children, and like the intensity of childbirth, it frightened me. Like it scared me when I saw it. And it's interesting, right? You know, why is Jesus using this illustration of childbirth when it comes to sorrow? So he's addressing his disciples, and obviously we know that Jesus taught in stories, and he taught in hyperbole, and he used illustration all the time. But why would he choose this illustration? Why would he connect sorrow to childbirth? And I think it's because he wants us to see that it is precious, that it is sacred, that it is important, that sorrow needs to be stewarded. It is not something that we should just want to get rid of. It is not something that we should just want to ignore or avoid or dread. Right? It is something that we have to see as sacred, as precious, and it requires us to steward it. It requires us to handle with care. It requires us to actually invest into this season. And man, what if we could see sorrow as something to steward? What if we could change our thinking as to say, man, this is critical, this is important, because if we steward it well, then it can bring about new life. If we steward sorrow, if we take the difficult moments that life throws at us, and if we could steward that, then all of a sudden it can bring new life through it. I really think that's what Jesus is trying to teach us here. So the question becomes, how do you steward it? Like, how do you steward suffering? It's already such an opposite idea. It's already so counterintuitive that we would want to embrace this difficulty that we are experiencing and make the most of it. So how do we actually do the right things in the midst of it so that it produces new life within us? And I think we just look at Jesus. We look at what he does when he suffers. How does Jesus respond to his suffering? Like this last week, we've just been walking with Jesus on his journey to the cross, and we see how he stewards suffering. We go first to the garden. Here is Jesus, just moments from being betrayed, being arrested. This whole terrible process is about to begin, and he's praying, and he's with his friends. What is he doing in that moment? Here he is in the depths of despair. And what does he make sure to do? He brings his friends with him. He brings his guys with him. He's like, hey, come with me, pray for me. Like, I need this. But he doesn't just stop with his friends. He is consistently, constantly reaching out to God. He's not doing it alone. He is expressing his needs to his friends, and he is confessing his needs to God. In the midst of sorrow, what is our temptation? To isolate, to pull away. We don't want to involve people in this season. But here is Jesus modeling for us that no, we actually need to invite people into what's happening in our hearts, in our minds, in our lives. And we need to open up to God all the things that we are thinking, that we are feeling. There has to be a high degree of communion between us and people and us and God. We cannot do it alone. But then we fast forward from the garden to this gathering of religious leaders, where Jesus is standing before these scribes and Pharisees and all these men that are trying to accuse him. And I think it's a very significant moment because his identity, his deity, right? His claims are being questioned. And Jesus' response are actually Old Testament messianic prophecies, where Jesus grabs from Psalms 110, Jesus grabs from Daniel 7, that he takes these messianic prophecies and he uses those to answer these religious leaders. And this is so significant because what Jesus is modeling for us in the midst of suffering is that he is remembering the promises of God. That he's not just reaching out to men and reaching out to God, but he's actually remembering and declaring and clinging to the promises of God. Church family, there are thousands of promises that God has made to each one of us. And in the midst of sorrow, that is the time to remember those. That is the time to cling to those. That is the time to declare those promises. We have to take time and remember all of the good, all of the great things that God has promised us, even in the midst of our sorrow. But then we fast forward from this gathering and we go to a hill called Golgotha. We go to a graveyard where a cross has been stationed and where a man is hanging, just gasping for air, trying to breathe. And what do we see Jesus do there? He dies. He dies. He breathes his last breath. And I think, how are we to find any type of model in that? And I think this is the hardest thing for us to see. This is the hardest part for us to practice. Where Jesus is modeling this attitude of just holding things loosely, letting things go, allowing things to die in the midst of sorrow. And it's not just on the cross that we see him do this. We see him do this literally from the upper room to the cross. Here we see Jesus before he washes the disciples' feet. What does the text say? It says that the Father has placed all things into his hands. What does that mean? That Jesus is the most powerful person who has ever lived in that moment. And what does he do? He doesn't cling to that power. He doesn't leverage that power. What's he do? He lays it all down and he performs this absolutely embarrassing, humiliating act of washing his disciples' feet. We go back to the garden when he is arrested, and there is this moment that is recorded in the Gospels where he speaks and he knocks down all of these soldiers just with his breath. He lets just a little bit of glory out of him. And in a single moment, you see how absolutely powerful Jesus is, how mighty he is, how much strength he actually possesses. And is he leveraging that? He could stop it all from happening. He could keep these soldiers at bay. He could wipe out everyone and everything within his proximity, but he doesn't. What does he do? He lays it all down. He sets it all aside. Even throughout all of the trials, he never tries to defend himself, taking his cross all the way up to the hill. And as he's hanging on it, says, "Father, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do." What is Jesus saying? He's not allowing himself to be bitter. He's not allowing himself to pick up offense. He is letting it go. This is the hardest thing for us to see in the midst of sorrow. That often sorrow is a sign in our lives that something needs to die. That there's something that we're holding too tightly to, that we have to just let go of, that we have to release, that we have to surrender to the Lord. It is often a sign that we have placed our hope, we've placed our trust, we've placed our purpose into something other than Christ, and it is under attack. It is being threatened, and it is proving itself to be less than sufficient to provide the things for us that we are needing it to provide. And our reaction to that is to freak out, to just be utterly depressed, to just be totally lost, totally lost. And I think for us, not only do we have to involve people and reach out to others and remember the promises of God, but we have to be willing to let go of the things that God wants us to let go of and trust Him with it. Sometimes we just got to let things die. And that's hard. That's hard. But the resurrection says to us that something else, that oftentimes when we trust God to let something die, something new comes to life. It's exactly what Jesus is trying to teach us here. He's like, when you trust me with this and you let that go, something new will be reborn. There will be renewal. There will be refreshing. There will be resurrection, and it will be greater than you could even imagine. Last thing, and then I'm done. Last way that we can see sorrow, Jesus tells us in verse 22. Look at what he says. So also, you have sorrow now, but I will see you again, and your hearts will rejoice, and no one will take your joy from you. I am not a fan of sadness. I don't like sorrow. I don't like sad movies. Amber and I went to go see The Magnificent Seven. It has Chris Pratt in it, so anything that Chris Pratt's in, I go and see, because me and him are like BFFs. But we went to go see The Magnificent Seven, and not only did Chris Pratt die in the movie, spoiler alert, but like everyone dies. And I got to the end of the movie, and I was like, I will never watch that movie again. And I haven't. To this day, I haven't seen it because it doesn't end happy. It just ends sad. If you want to guarantee that I will only watch a movie one time, or nay, that I will not like a movie at all, and if it ends sad, tragically, I'm not going to like it. A movie's job is to leave me happy, okay? And if it doesn't do that, then it has failed me. I do not like sadness. I don't like when my kids are sad. My older kids have learned this. My younger two are learning it. But all we got to do is be sad, and dad crumbles. This is the most tragic thing in my life. I thought my whole life, man, I'm going to be the hard-nosed father. Like, I'm going to be the no nonsense. Like, don't mess with me. When I lay down the law, I see it through all the way to the end, no matter what. And you know what? What has actually ended up happening? I am the softy, right? Amber is the consistent hard nose, like, no, Josh, we said this, and so we're going to do this. And I'm like, you're right, that's what we need to do. But all they have to do is just be like, oh, Dad, I'm just so sad. And I'm like, oh, honey, I don't want you to be sad. I don't know, Am, maybe we can rearrange this. Maybe we can fix this a little bit. I mean, because I hate my kids being sad. I don't want them to be sad. I don't like when people in my life are sad. My whole life. Do you want to know why I tend to be the funny one? Because I just don't like people being sad. I just want them all. I want us all to be happy. I want you to be happy. I want to be happy. I want everyone around me to be happy all the time, because I don't like sadness. I have always seen sorrow as something to avoid. I have always seen sorrow as something to ignore. I have always seen sorrow as something to reframe. Like, I gotta somehow rationalize this in my mind so it's not sad anymore. I need to make it happy. And here's the truth: through this text, Jesus sees sorrow very differently, very, very differently. Verse 22 is not just saying, Jesus is saying, don't see sorrow as something to avoid or ignore. Here's how we have to see sorrow. You have to see it as something to journey through. To journey through. We can't just discard it. We can't just rationalize it. Sorrow is something that we journey through, and the death, burial, and resurrection is testimony of that. When presented with sorrow, when presented with sadness, when presented with the cross, what does Jesus do? He doesn't ignore it. He doesn't avoid it. He doesn't try to make somebody else do it or deal with it. He embraces it. And yet he journeys through it. He journeys through it, ultimately to experience resurrection and bring hope to all of humanity. Like today, here's what you need to hear. And for anyone where this season has just taken, where this season has just created uncertainty and so much sadness, here's what you need to hear today. Jesus journeyed through sorrow and suffering alone, all by himself, so that you wouldn't have to. Not to keep you from experiencing sorrow, but just to promise you that you don't have to journey through sorrow alone. And man, I'm telling you, if you have the courage to journey through sorrow with Jesus, the guarantee on the other side of that is joy. The guarantee, it is Jesus' promise and guarantee that if you journey through sorrow with him, that if you refuse to settle for it and stay there, that if you choose to steward it, and that if you have the courage to journey through it, on the other side of it is joy. But it's not fragile joy, it's not fleeting joy, it's not breakable joy. What does Jesus say? He says it is a joy that cannot be taken from you. Nobody can rob you of the joy that you experience on the other side of sorrow. That's good news, man. That's good news. And it's why today that there are billions of Christians around the world celebrating what Jesus not only did for us on the cross, but how he rose from the dead and what that means for us every single day. Jesus, we love you so much. And God, so many of us are just so sad. Lord, help us recognize that we don't have to settle for this. We don't have to stay here. We don't have to stay in the midst of our sorrow. God, help us see sorrow as something to steward, to handle with care, to embrace. Help us follow your model of stewarding sorrow. But Lord, also help us see that this is something we journey through. There's no getting around it. There's no ignoring it. There's no avoiding it, God. But Lord, you did it alone so that we didn't have to. And so Lord, give us the courage to journey through sorrow and find a joy that cannot be taken from us. Father, in your precious name, amen.